The sirens didn't just echo through the quiet suburban street. They shattered it, slicing through the calm like a warning no one could ignore. And standing in the middle of it all was Mariah Cole, a Black Army veteran who had faced war zones, ambushes, and the kind of fear most people only see in movies. Yet nothing in her years of service had prepared her for this moment, for the flashing red and blue lights surrounding her modest home, for the officers stepping out of their vehicles with hands already hovering near their weapons, for the way her neighbors peeked through curtains as if she had suddenly become the villain in a story she didn't even know she was part of, and most of all, for the tightening in her chest that told her something was very, very wrong. She stood still, boots planted firmly on the ground, as if instinct had taken over, the same instinct that once kept her alive overseas, her eyes scanning every movement, every gesture, every twitch of tension in the officer's shoulders. Because she knew this posture. She knew this energy. It wasn't routine. It wasn't calm. It was escalation waiting for a spark. And behind her, just inside the doorway, two figures waited silently, watching, sensing, understanding more than any human there could possibly grasp. Her dogs, Titan and Rhea, both trained not just as companions, but as protectors. Former military canine trainees she had adopted after her discharge, animals that had seen discipline, chaos, and loyalty in its purest form. And now they stood still, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the unfolding scene, as if they knew that everything in their world was about to change. "Ma'am, step forward slowly," one officer shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. But there was something off in the way he said it. Not authority, but fear disguised as control. And Mariah raised her hand slightly, not in surrender, but in measured compliance, her mind racing through possibilities, replaying every decision she had made in the past 24 hours, trying to understand how she had gone from a quiet morning coffee to being surrounded like a suspect in a high-risk operation. And then it hit her. The call she had made earlier, reporting a suspicious vehicle circling her block repeatedly. A detail she hadn't thought twice about at the time, but now it seemed like a thread being pulled tight around her, turning her from the caller into the target. "I'm the one who called this in," she said firmly, her voice steady, despite the storm building around her. But instead of easing the tension, her words seemed to harden it, and the officers exchanged glances that only made her more uneasy, because that was when she realized they weren't here because of her call. They were here because of something else. Something she didn't yet understand. And before she could ask another question, one of them moved forward, his hand gripping his radio. "We have a visual suspect matches description," he said, and the words felt like a punch to the gut, because suddenly the situation snapped into a terrifying clarity. They thought she was someone else, or worse. They thought she was exactly who they were looking for. The air shifted, heavy and electric, and behind her, Titan let out a low, controlled growl, not aggressive, but protective, a warning that something was off, that his human was in danger. And Mariah subtly shook her head, without turning, a silent command for him to stay, because she knew how quickly things could spiral if the officers misread the dog's intentions. But it was already too late for calm, because one officer raised his weapon slightly, not fully aimed, but enough to change everything, enough to turn a misunderstanding into a potential tragedy. And in that moment, time seemed to fracture, stretching every second into something unbearable. And Mariah's training kicked in, not just as a soldier, but as a survivor, calculating, assessing, choosing every movement with precision. "Listen to me," she said, louder now, her voice carrying the authority she had earned through years of service. "You've got the wrong person." But the words seemed to bounce off a wall of suspicion, because fear had already taken hold on both sides, and fear doesn't listen, it reacts. And then it happened, the moment no one could have predicted, the moment that would later spread across headlines and social media, the moment that would leave everyone who witnessed it in stunned silence. Because as one officer suddenly lunged forward, perhaps to restrain her, or perhaps out of panic, Titan moved, not in a wild, uncontrolled attack, but in a precise, calculated intervention, placing himself squarely between Mariah and the officer, his body low, his stance firm, his eyes locked with a focus that spoke of training, not aggression. and Rhea followed instantly, circling slightly, not to attack, but to create space, to control the situation in a way that only highly trained animals could. And the officers froze, completely caught off guard, because this wasn't chaos. It was control. It was strategy. It was something they hadn't prepared for. And for a brief, surreal moment, the entire scene paused, as if everyone realized they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. "Don't move," another officer shouted, but this time his voice cracked, uncertainty bleeding through, because now the power dynamic had shifted, not through violence, but through presence, through the undeniable fact that these dogs were not just pets. They were protectors who understood the line between threat and restraint better than the humans holding guns. And Mariah slowly lowered her hands, not in defiance, but in calm, controlled motion, placing one hand gently on Titan's back, grounding him, grounding herself. "They won't hurt anyone," she said quietly. And for the first time since the sirens arrived, there was a flicker of hesitation in the officer's eyes, a crack in the wall of assumption that had brought them here. And then, almost as if the universe itself decided to intervene, a voice crackled through one of the radios, sharp and urgent. "All units, be advised. Suspect located 2 blocks east. Repeat, suspect located." And just like that, everything changed. The tension collapsed into stunned realization. The officer's posture shifted from aggression to confusion, and then to something heavier: regret. Because the truth had arrived too late to erase what had already happened, too late to undo the fear, the humiliation, the moment that had nearly spiraled into tragedy. The weapons lowered. The sirens seemed quieter now, almost ashamed. And Mariah stood there, her heart still pounding, her hand still resting on Titan as Rhea slowly relaxed her stance, the danger passing like a storm that had come too close. And no one spoke for a few seconds, because what could they say? What words could bridge the gap between suspicion and understanding, between what almost happened and what was narrowly avoided? And finally, one officer stepped forward, his voice subdued. "Ma'am, we're sorry." But the apology felt small compared to the weight of the moment, and Mariah simply nodded, not because it was enough, but because she understood something they didn't yet, that this wasn't just about her. It was about a system, about assumptions, about how quickly things can go wrong when fear leads instead of truth. And as the officers began to disperse, the flashing lights fading into the distance, the neighbors slowly retreating behind their doors, the street returning to its quiet rhythm, Mariah turned back toward her home, her dogs walking beside her, not as heroes seeking recognition, but as loyal guardians who had done exactly what they were trained to do: protect without unnecessary harm, act without hesitation, and stand firm when everything else faltered. And as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her, one thing was certain: this wasn't the end of the story, because moments like this don't just disappear. They echo, they spread, they force conversations, and somewhere, someone would hear about what happened on that street, about the veteran, the police, and the dogs who changed everything. And they would ask themselves the same question: what would have happened if those dogs hadn't been there?